17-year-old Mary Jane Reed lived in the town of Oregon, Illinois. She and her family lived in Sandtown, the section of town to the east of the Rock River. The modest community was considered to be the wrong side of town by some. She was the fifth of 6 children, and her father Clifford worked repairing machines at the National Silica Company plant. Mary Jane was 11 years older than her one younger sibling, her brother Warren, and she doted on him. She would routinely take him to the movies and to church, go on long walks with him, and pack picnic lunches for them to eat at a park near the river. She began teaching Sunday school when she was 15 and earned a certificate from Oregon Bible College. Mary Jane had left school during her sophomore year at Oregon High School to help support her ill mother, Ruth, whose severe rheumatoid arthritis left her unable to perform basic tasks around the house. To financially help her family, Mary Jane took a job as a switchboard operator for the DeKalb Ogle Telephone Company and used her salary to purchase items for the home. It was through this job that she met a 28-year-old World War II veteran named Stanley Skridla. Stanley was one of 5 children and was born and raised in Rockford, Illinois, 25 miles northeast of Oregon. After finishing school, he worked as a cabinet maker and a machinist before enlisting in the Navy in October of 1943. He served in the Pacific on the USS Ormsby as a machinist's mate, originally 3rd class, but eventually 2nd class. He received an honorable discharge in December of 1945 and began a job as a lineman for the Illinois Bell Telephone Company in February of 1946. He lived with his widowed mother on Loomis Street in Rockford. Stanley met Mary Jane by speaking to her over the phone, during phone calls he made to test phone wires he was working on in the Oregon area. Mary Jane and Stanley made plans to have their first date on June 25, 1948. That day, Mary Jane worked the 6 to 10 p.m. shift at the phone company. Stanley called her to confirm their plans that afternoon, but she was not able to call him back until 8:30. Stanley then drove to Oregon from Rockford to meet Mary Jane when she finished work. Mary Jane and Stanley were seen at 2 or 3 bars around Oregon that night. They were last seen outside a local tavern, speaking with an unknown man and woman around 11:30 that night. Neither Mary Jane nor Stanley arrived home that night. After leaving the final tavern they visited, Mary Jane and Stanley had apparently driven to a lover's lane along Country Line Road on the southern outskirts of town. Early the following morning, a state highway worker was driving down that road on his way to set up some fishing lines. On his way, he came across a man's Oxford shoe in the middle of the gravel road. When he stopped to investigate, he found the body of Stanley Skridla in a ditch on the side of the road. He had been shot 5 times, once in the chest and 4 times in the lower abdomen. It was estimated that he was killed between 1 and 2 a.m. According to authorities, it appeared Stanley had been pulled from his car and shot. His body had then been dragged off to the side of the road. At the scene, they found a large pool of blood, a cigarette stained with red lipstick, and 5 .32 caliber shells. Stanley's car was located a short time later, parked approximately a mile away from the scene, in a parking lot across the street from one of the establishments he and Mary Jane had visited the previous night. There was no blood inside of the car. No one could find Mary Jane Reed. Local and county authorities began a massive search for the missing girl and received help from local volunteers. Hundreds of people were a part of the effort, searching remote areas in and outside of Oregon. The Reed family held on to hope that Mary Jane was still alive. These hopes were bolstered when they received a phone call from a psychic, who assured them that Mary Jane was not dead. She was unharmed, but being held captive by a man with a dark complexion, and would return home soon. Desperate as they were for information, the family found solace in this account. The psychic's vision was proven wrong on June 29th, 4 days after Mary Jane disappeared, when a 28-year-old truck driver named Harold Sigler discovered her body. Harold worked for the National Silica Company, who also employed Mary Jane's father. On the morning of the 29th, Harold was driving down a company lane, approximately 2 miles away from the Lover's Lane where Stanley's body had been found, to reach a sandpit owned by the company, from which he was to haul sand. He stopped along the way to speak with another driver, and when he left his truck, he noticed a foul smell, and discovered Mary Jane's body amongst the weeds under a box elm tree, some 4 feet off of the road. Mary Jane was wearing just her bra, underwear, and her mother's wedding ring. Ruth had given her the ring as a gift once her arthritis prevented her from wearing it, and Mary Jane had been thrilled to have it. The rest of the clothing Mary Jane had been wearing the last night she was alive had been thrown on top of her body. According to her death certificate, Mary Jane had been shot once in the back of her head, near the base of her skull. She, like Stanley, had been shot with a .32 caliber bullet, believed to be from the same weapon used to kill Stanley. Authorities believed that she had not been held captive when she was taken from the Lover's Lane, but had rather been killed not long after Stanley's death. Ruth Reed was so distraught over the death of her daughter, and fearful that the same fate would befall another member of her family, that she refused to allow her son Warren to attend school for months. Clifford Reed ultimately made the decision to place her in a state mental institution a year after Mary Jane died. Ruth returned home after a year, but was never the same. Investigators spoke to dozens of people to try to find leads in the case. Mary Jane had been very popular, regularly going on dates, so authorities spoke to other young men she had socialized with. They also interviewed 4 women in Rockford Stanley had previously dated. Rumors circulated that the murders were the result of a love triangle gone wrong, or payback from some sort of gambling debt Stanley had accrued. The theory in the case that became perhaps the most popular and persistent was that Mary Jane and Stanley had been killed by a local chief deputy sheriff. He and Mary Jane had a brief relationship, but Mary Jane no longer wanted to be involved with the older married man. On the afternoon before Mary Jane went missing, he showed up at her home to try to convince her to continue seeing him. He grabbed her by the arm as she struggled to get away from him. He struck her several times before throwing her to the ground and finally leaving. The deputy reportedly also ran into Mary Jane at one of the bars she and Stanley visited while out on their date, meaning that he had known she was out with another man. According to a police report at the time, the deputy had reported to work the day after Stanley's body was discovered without his service weapon, claiming he had sold it to someone in a bar. This led to whispers around town that police had not solved the case because they were covering up for one of their own. The deputy passed away in the mid-1980s. As the years went on, rumors and speculation continued, but progress in the case came to a halt, and it remained unsolved for decades. Over those decades, both of Mary Jane's parents, as well as all but one of her siblings, passed away without learning who killed her. The lack of answers in the case did not diminish local interest in the story, or hope in Mary Jane's brother, Warren Reed, that it would eventually be resolved. Major developments in the case would come more than 50 years after Mary Jane and Stanley were murdered, with the help of a somewhat controversial local figure. Mike Arians had worked as an insurance fraud investigator, a dinner theater producer, and a county commissioner in King County, Illinois, before he purchased a restaurant in Oregon. Now known as the Roadhouse, the establishment had previously been known as the Stenhouse, and had been one of the places Stanley and Mary Jane had visited the night they were killed. Stanley's Buick had been found parked across the street from it after his body was discovered. Mike purchased the restaurant the year of the 50th anniversary of Mary Jane and Stanley's murders. As such, the story was featured heavily in the local media and caught Mike's attention. However, he soon decided to run for mayor of Oregon, which diverted his focus from the case until after his election to the position in April of 1999. Perhaps because of his own modest background, Mike became increasingly concerned that Mary Jane Reed had been viewed by the authorities at the time of her murder as disposable because she came from the lower-class area of Sandtown. He began hearing more details about the case from people around town, which led to him reaching out to people connected to the case, including Mary Jane's brother, Warren. While Mike claims he simply wants justice for Mary Jane and Stanley, he does have detractors, who view him as either obsessive or opportunistic, rather than altruistic. Mr. Arians is full of it. He's a jerk. He's trying to make money. Melvin Messer, a former Ogle County sheriff, told the Chicago Tribune in 2012. Allegations that Mike has tried to use Mary Jane and Stanley's deaths for his own profit stem largely from his efforts to get a book written and a movie made about the case. Neither of those projects ever came to fruition. Mary Jane specifically also plays a part in Mike's restaurant business. Mike has what some have described as a shrine to her at the Roadhouse, featuring numerous framed pictures and articles, a portrait drawn in pencil, and a mannequin dressed as Mary Jane. While this could be viewed as a marketing ploy, Mike claims he has all the items on display to celebrate Mary Jane's life and make sure she is not forgotten. Mary Jane did visit what is now the Roadhouse just hours before her death, and Mike believes that visit continues to tie her to his restaurant. He has repeatedly said that he does not particularly like the term haunted, but he does believe that Mary Jane maintains a determined presence in his restaurant. He claims that employees have seen apparitions in the restaurant, and points to events like the repeated, spontaneous playing of the same song on the jukebox and unexplained gusts of cold air in the Roadhouse as evidence of Mary Jane's presence there. He has held seances in the restaurant, which was also featured on an episode of the Travel Channel show The Dead Files. According to Mike, his critics are wrong to claim that he has financially benefited from his investigation into the case. Business at the restaurant went down dramatically after he became involved with the case, and within just the first few years of his efforts, he had personally spent tens of thousands of dollars doing research and hiring private investigators. He further claims that his interest in Mary Jane and Stanley's case was part of the reason he lost his bid for re-election as mayor of Oregon in 2003. There are, of course, other reasons which could explain why the people of Oregon did not vote to re-elect Mike. For example, in December of 1999, he was indicted on charges of official misconduct and disregard of election laws in relation to his legal place of residence at the time he held his different government positions. In order to be qualified to serve as mayor of Oregon, he had to have been a legal resident of the town, which is in Ogle County, for at least a year prior to his election in April of 1999. However, he had been a county commissioner in Kane County, a position which required him to be a legal resident of that county until the end of 1998. Mike subsequently filed a civil lawsuit against the Kane County State's Attorney, alleging prosecutorial misconduct. Proceedings dragged on for almost 2 years. In October of 2001, Mike ultimately dropped his lawsuit and paid a fine to settle the matter, but the legal case could also be viewed as a potential reason for why Mike was not re-elected, rather than his investigation into Mary Jane and Stanley's deaths. Regardless of the criticisms that have been made of him, Mike did play a major part in the significant developments in the case made decades after Mary Jane and Stanley were killed. In January of 2004, Mike filed court documents requesting that Mary Jane's body be exhumed from her grave in Daysville Cemetery, a process he was willing to pay for himself. Mike hoped that DNA could be found and used to identify a suspect. Furthermore, he argued that there were several problems with the original investigation that could only be resolved by exhuming Mary Jane's remains. No formal autopsy was performed on Mary Jane's body in 1948. Neither her nor Stanley's death certificates had been signed by the coroner, and his name had simply been typewritten onto the line where his signature should have been made. Mike also claimed that his investigation had raised concerns that Mary Jane's skull had not been buried with the rest of her body. A judge signed off on the exhumation in July of 2005, and it took place the following month. On the morning of August 23, 2005, Mary Jane's remains were exhumed and x-rayed at Bushell Community Hospital before being examined by forensic pathologists at the Ogle County Morgue. The 6-hour examination was videotaped and photographed. Several of Mary Jane's fingernails were collected, as were several pubic hairs and various swabs to check for any evidence of sexual assault. The skull, several vertebrae, and a femur were not sent back to the cemetery with the rest of the remains, so that further forensic testing and examination could be performed on them. Mary Jane had been buried still wearing her mother's gold wedding ring, which was given to her brother Warren after the examination. Warren felt the process had been handled properly, and that the pathologists who had examined the remains had been very respectful. Mary Jane's remains were reinterred in the afternoon of the day of the exhumation, with a Bible, signed by Ruth Reed, his son, his daughter, and Mike Arians, tucked inside the casket with her. While there was a skull buried in Mary Jane's casket, it proved to be one of the most confusing and controversial pieces of evidence in the case. Ruth Reed had struggled to obtain the bones that had not been reinterred after the exhumation, following their initial review by the Illinois State Police. He wanted other experts to examine the bones, but authorities wanted to cremate them before returning them to him. He eventually received custody of them, and Mike Arians had the skull and vertebrae examined by forensic experts. Those experts determined that the skull found in Mary Jane's casket was not Mary Jane's. This realization was made by examining the C1 and C2 vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae closest to the skull. The C1 vertebra belonged with the skull, and the C2 vertebra belonged with the vertebrae below it. But the C1 and C2 vertebrae did not fit together as they should have, instead forming what the experts described as an impossible articulation. The experts determined the skull and C1 vertebra came from a girl around the same age Mary Jane had been at the time of her death, but the bones they had been given to examine came from two different individuals. Furthermore, the skull did show signs that the person it belonged to had been shot in the head. However, the bullet hole showed that the owner of the skull had been shot in the face, to the left of her nose. Mary Jane's death certificate indicates that she had been shot in the back of her head, near the base of her skull. In late 2005, following the exhumation, the Ogle County Sheriff's Office opened a new investigation into Mary Jane and Stanley's case. Based on the results of that investigation, the Sheriff's Office announced that they had come to the conclusion that a man from Waterloo, Iowa, had killed Stanley during a botched robbery, while his brother, a resident of Oregon, looked on. They took Mary Jane with them, ultimately deciding to kill her to eliminate her as a witness. Both of the brothers had since passed away. The Sheriff's Office could not formally close the case, or conclusively tie the brothers to the crime, however, and only classified them as persons of interest in the case. The report also specifically stated that the investigation had found no evidence supporting the popular local theory that the deputy sheriff had been involved in the murders. Ogle County Sheriff's Captain Rich Wilkinson did note in his report that his investigation indicated that social and political considerations may have influenced the original investigation, and that important evidence went undocumented or unshared with the proper agencies. This investigation, in my opinion, was corrupt and mishandled from the start, and nothing I am aware of can possibly change those facts, he wrote. Exhuming Mary Jane's remains raised more questions than it answered, but Mike Arians did eventually contact Stanley's remaining family members to secure their support for him petitioning the court to allow for the exhumation of Stanley's remains as well. The request for the exhumation was ultimately granted, and it occurred on May 28, 2015, at Cavalry Catholic Cemetery in Winnebago, Illinois. Stanley's remains were x-rayed and examined. 2.32 caliber bullets were located and submitted to the Illinois State Crime Lab for analysis. 7 months later, the Sheriff's Office released a statement about the lab's findings. Only one of the bullets had been in good enough condition to be used for comparison, and it had been compared to a .32 caliber handgun that had been identified during the course of the investigation. The gun had not fired the bullet. The statement concluded by stating that the Sheriff's Office believed that everyone involved in Mary Jane and Stanley's murders had since passed away. While disinterring Stanley did not provide evidence that solved the case, it did ultimately have a positive result. Stanley's wooden casket had been found submerged in a foot of water inside of his burial vault, and was in poor shape. When his remains were reinterred on the afternoon of the 28th, they were in a new casket. A Catholic priest presided over a graveside service, and an honor guard from the local VFW chapter fired a salute. These signs of respect for Stanley and his memory were all appreciated by his nephew. Following Stanley's exhumation and the subsequent testing, Mike Arians took a step back from actively investigating the case, having spent countless hours and more than $100,000 on the case. "I've done all that I can do," he told Ted Gregory of the Chicago Tribune. "Hopefully my efforts over the past 17 years haven't been in vain, and that enough of the dots that I've created can be connected that law enforcement can color in the picture. That would be a perfect world for me." Mike continued speaking with Ted Gregory for his 2017 book on the case, and maintains a website dedicated to it. While recent efforts to use modern technology to solve the decades-old mystery of who killed Mary Jane Reed and Stanley Skridla have so far not been successful in that objective, they have ensured that Mary Jane and Stanley's memories live on, more than 70 years after their deaths.